Today we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Section 3, and the purpose of this video is really just an introduction to some of the important background vocabulary for understanding genetics. Before we get started, you want to make sure that you have the correct Power Notes sheet. Notice that there is one Power Notes sheet for Chapter 6, Sections 3 through 5. This video is only going to cover the first part of this presentation, where we're talking about some of the vocabulary, like gene versus allele, character versus trait. We'll talk about genotypes, how we symbolize the genetics of an organism, dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, and then the last thing that we will discuss in this video is phenotype. Do not go on to Mendel's experiments. We are going to discuss that in class. So let's begin our discussion with just a brief introduction here to Gregor Mendel. This is what he looked like. He was an Austrian monk, and he was very famous for studying inheritance of various traits. The term trait refers to a specific variation of a characteristic of an organism. And he's known as the father of modern genetics because he really laid the groundwork for understanding how genes work. And this is really impressive to think about him doing this in a time when scientists did not even know what DNA was or how it was structured or how it could code for information. In Mendel's time, a lot of people thought that traits were simply blended together. So you would have two parents. They may have similar traits, they may have opposite traits, but they would just kind of mix together like you were mixing paint. And then their offspring would be some mixture of the two parents. But as you can see over time, that would really result in all of the offspring starting to become very similar. And that's not what happens. So Gregor Mendel showed that this blending hypothesis for inheritance was not true. And what he was able to demonstrate through his experimentation is that traits are actually inherited as discrete units. What that means is that one parent can pass down one version of a trait and another parent can pass down the other version of the trait. And instead of blending together, the offspring could inherit the full version of either one of those characteristics. So let's talk about what he studied. He used the pea plant as his experimental organism, and he studied 7 different characteristics of pea plants. Now, when we're talking about the term characteristic or character, that does have a specific meaning in genetics. When we say character, we are talking about a heritable physical feature, such as flower color. Flower color would be one character that Mendel studied on the pea plants. Another one might be seed shape. That is a specific heritable feature. Now, the variation of that feature, we refer to those as traits. So a trait is simply going to be what variation of a character is showing up in the offspring. So let's look at that flower color character. That character in the pea plants that Mendel studied had 2 different trait variations. There was the purple variation, that's one trait, and then there was the white flower variation, that is the other trait for that same characteristic of flower color. If you remember our discussion of genes and alleles, character is synonymous with gene. We have a gene, which is a specific segment of DNA that codes for a specific character, like flower color. There's one location on the pea plant chromosome that codes for flower color. And then the alleles are synonymous with traits. The traits are the variation that is expressed, and alleles, remember, are variations of genes. So here is a great summary of those 7 different characteristics that Mendel studied. You can see the character names are listed across the top. Stem length, seed shape, all of those are the characters. It's not telling you what specific variation was present in a plant. The variation that is expressed is going to be the trait, right? So for flower color, the characteristic, there are two traits, either purple or white. If we look at seed color, that's the characteristic. There's two trait variations, one yellow, one green. So these were the 7 characteristics and those variations of those characteristics that Mendel studied. And it was very fortunate that he studied these because they do have very simple inheritance patterns. If there was something more complex happening, Mendel probably would not have been able to learn as much about genetics as he did. As we just discussed, an allele is going to be an alternative form of a gene. So let's review what terminology we would use for an organism based on the alleles that it has inherited. Remember that each parent is going to be donating one allele. We get one set of chromosomes from each parent. So each set of chromosomes is going to have an allele for every single gene. If those two alleles are the same, then we would say the organism is homozygous. Homo means same. So a homozygous organism would have 2 of the exact same alleles for a specific gene. Now, what do we call it if they are different? You may remember this term is heterozygous. That would be the term we use for an organism that has 2 different alleles for the same gene. Let's look at an example here. This is an example from pea plants. We can see 2 homologous chromosomes, a purple one and a green one. In a homozygous individual, both chromosomes, they have a gene, right? Here's the gene location or locus for the seed shape. Notice that both genes have the allele for wrinkled seeds. So this is a homozygous individual. It has 2 alleles that are both for wrinkled seeds. Therefore, we use the term homozygous. Compare that to a heterozygous individual. Its 2 homologous chromosomes, notice they both have the same gene. This is the gene for seed shape, but there are 2 different alleles present. You have a wrinkled allele on one chromosome, a round allele on the other. Now remember, these 2 homologous chromosomes, one of them came from one parent and one came from the other. So that explains how we might have 2 different alleles for the same gene in one organism. When we write about alleles, we normally abbreviate this using letters. And we use letters based on whether an allele is dominant, which simply means it's expressed whenever you have at least one copy of the allele. If it's dominant, that allele is being expressed. Versus recessive. A recessive allele is covered up by a dominant allele if there's a dominant allele present. If there is no dominant allele present, then a recessive allele gets expressed. We would actually get to see the result of that allele only if there are no dominant alleles present to cover it up. So when we think about representing alleles with letters, the dominant alleles are represented by an uppercase letter, and the recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. We use the same letter for the gene, whether it's dominant or recessive. And the only way to tell if something is dominant or recessive is based on whether that letter is capitalized or not. So let's look at an example here of dominant alleles versus recessive alleles. If we have these 2 homologous chromosomes, one has a wrinkled allele, one has a round allele. Round is dominant. Even though there is only one round allele present, look at the end result. We call this the phenotype, the way it actually is physically expressed. This phenotype is a round seed. Even though there was a wrinkled allele there, that got covered up. So we would say wrinkled is recessive and round would be the dominant allele because it shows up even though there was only one copy of that allele present. In order to get a wrinkled phenotype in this seed here, we would have to have 2 wrinkled alleles. We would not have any round allele at all on these 2 sets of chromosomes here because in order to have wrinkled seeds, which is recessive, You can't have any dominant alleles, or that would cover up your recessive phenotype. So let's make sure that you have those terms defined correctly. A genotype is going to be a description of the actual genes of the organism. Which alleles does it have for a particular gene? And you can describe that in a couple of different ways. You can say a true breeding or a purebred organism. That indicates that both of the alleles are going to be the same. It means the same as homozygous. So homozygous is another way to describe the genotype of an organism. Now do make sure if you're saying homozygous, you're either saying homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Homozygous just means the same allele, so you have to indicate whether that allele is dominant or recessive. Now this symbol here of 2 capital F's or 2 lowercase f's, those symbols are another way that you could describe genotype. So you can either use words like homozygous or you can use symbols like what you see here. It doesn't matter which way you describe a genotype, as long as when you describe it, you are indicating what the 2 alleles are for a particular gene, then you are describing its genotype. Now, maybe we have a heterozygous organism. We sometimes call those hybrids. So if you see the term hybrid, a hybrid pea plant would be a heterozygous pea plant. That is still describing a genotype. Heterozygous, however, means those 2 alleles are different. You have one dominant and one recessive. You do not need to use the word dominant after heterozygous. We would not say that this is a heterozygous dominant genotype. We would just say that it's heterozygous. Heterozygous already means one dominant and one recessive. And finally, phenotype. This is the last thing that we're discussing today. This is going to be the physical expression of a trait. It's what you actually see. It's what gets expressed in the final organism. So we're not using symbols here. We're simply describing how it looks. Something like purple flower color, white flower color, round seeds, wrinkled seeds. Those are all definitions or examples of phenotypes. So we're going to stop here in our notes. The rest of this presentation we will be discussing together in class. So hopefully this background information made sense to you. Make sure you understand the definitions that we discussed here today. And if you have any questions, please make sure you ask them in class.